All right, this lecture is designed to go along with the Cold War at a glance notes that can be found in Schoology. So as you're listening, follow along, fill in the charts as we go. If you need to pause or rewind, please do so. Okay, so the Cold War was a 50-year-long conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that we called the Cold War because it allegedly never got hot. Meaning that the US and Soviet Union never directly went to war with each other, never directly fought each other. So they found other ways around that. And one of the notable things about this, of course, is that during World War II, the US and Soviet Union fought alongside each other to defeat Nazi Germany. And while we did work together, the seeds for the Cold War were definitely sown during World War II. And so there are a few reasons why we wound up fighting each other. We're going to walk through four major reasons why we wound up fighting each other. So this is a picture of Winston Churchill on the left, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, FDR in the middle, President of the United States. No word on how he got himself into that seat because, of course, he couldn't walk by the end of the war. And then on the right is Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union. And so these three guys are the leaders of the most important countries. And this is at a peace conference in Yalta, where the Allies were trying to figure out, as the war wound down, what were we going to do about the world after the war was over. And this is a great picture of three people who really don't like each other pretending to get along. And you notice that the two who are smiling the widest are FDR and Stalin. And they did not like each other at all. And part of the reasons why they didn't like each other, and one of the causes of the Cold War, was this sort of tension between the United States, which stood for democracy and capitalism, freedom, and the Soviet Union, which was a communist dictatorship. And it's hard to square those two things together because, of course, communism coming out of the Industrial Revolution was this idea of the people, the workers, banding together across the world and doing their best to raise up workers in all countries. And, of course, communism in the Soviet Union was led by a dictatorship. And you would think that if government were going to control the economy of a country, they would do something about, I don't know, getting the people's input. Stalin wasn't about that, and neither was the Soviet Union. And so, much like the United States and our dedication to freedom during the Cold War being somewhat compromised by our desires to push our capitalist ideology across the globe, the Soviet dedication to communism in the face of the sort of dictatorial impulses of people like Stalin, there were neither side was really great, and we allowed those competing ideologies to be the source of this war that, as we get into, is going to drag a lot of people into, and so our sort of ideological differences were the first reason why the Cold War happened. The second major reason why the Cold War took place was the disagreement on what to do with Europe after World War II was over. This is a map that shows the split between NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East. The blue countries, of course, make up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which the United States was part of, and the countries in red are going to be the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union. And we'll come back to them a little bit more, but this is going to be, this map kind of shows the so-called Iron Curtain that separated Eastern Europe from Western Europe, and that Iron Curtain is going to run along the line between the white and blue countries in the West and the red countries in the East. And behind the Iron Curtain, of course, was the Soviet Union and its so-called satellite states. And much like a satellite, these states were expected to orbit around the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had a much more direct influence over what took place in those countries. They were all communists. They were typically led by dictatorships, and they did what the Soviet Union wanted them to do. Now, Yugoslavia was another communist country, but we're going to talk about them a little bit later, and the fact that while communist, their dictatorial leader did not get along with Joseph Stalin, and they didn't feel like they were a satellite. They felt like they were, in fact, a sort of partner or ally with the Soviet Union. Now, the blue countries, NATO, the United States never directly controlled those countries, right? And so we didn't have we did a lot of things to aid those countries, things like the Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, which helps rebuild Europe. But at no point did we go into European countries and directly take control of their governments or tell them this is what you have to do, which is very different from how the Soviet Union treated its allies or the satellite states of Eastern Europe. So number two, territory in Europe. Third cause is a policy called the domino theory. And this was the belief that because Marxist communism believed that the workers of the world should unite and rise up against the factory ownership and the upper class, that if you allowed communism to spread around the world, communists would get together in this sort of monolithic communism. And if we let communism spread, all of those countries would instantly be rivals with the United States and opposed to the United States. And so if we allowed communism to spread anywhere, it was just one more domino that would knock the others down. And so this is the justification behind us going to war in Korea in the 1950s, and it was definitely our justification for going to war in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. Now, is there evidence that Chinese communism and Vietnamese communism would have worked together with the Soviet Union to like overthrow the United States or shut down global capitalism? It wasn't necessarily like that. Chinese communists particularly didn't get along with the Soviet Union, and so they were two separate communist countries. They were not somehow united in this fight. And so while there's a lot of evidence that domino theory was kind of misguided, it was definitely a reason why we intervened in countries around the world. Often these were something we called proxy wars, where the Soviet Union might support communist elements in a country, and so that meant we had to support their opposition. And so it was war by proxy. We didn't directly fight each other, but we had sort of third parties that were fighting this struggle between democracy, capitalism, and communism and authoritarianism. And then last but not least, by the end of it, we come back to where we were in Yalta. The United States and Soviet Union saw themselves as rivals, and it was a competition. And we wanted to be number one. They wanted to be number one. And so our two countries just went at it. And we did what we had to do to show the world that we were, the more powerful side. Propaganda was common. 1980s, Reagan famously called the Soviet Union the evil empire. They, of course, thought that they looked at the United States and said, what has freedom gotten people in the United States? If you don't have money, you don't survive. And if you look at the propaganda image on the right, this is Soviet propaganda, prominently shown is an African-American person in the front of that, behind the sort of U.S. flag as prison. And while everyone may have had it equally bad in the Soviet Union, at least they were equal. And of course, this is their version of hiding behind how they treated minorities within their country by pointing the finger at the United States and how we were treating minorities in our country. And so the last thing was just, the competitive aspects of the Cold War. We competed on everything from the Olympics down to arts, and there were a couple of explicitly big competitions that we'll talk about later. All right, so there are a couple of terms that are used in relation to the Cold War that we should know. And the first is dividing the world into the sort of first world, second world, and third world. The first world was the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and aligned free market capitalist countries. Um, this group included Western Europe and ostensibly other countries that were free, but realistically, it included sort of core capitalist countries: the U.S., Canada, Japan, Australia, and Western Europe. The second world then was the Soviet Union, or the United Soviet Socialist Republics, the Warsaw Pact, its satellite states, and then that was really kind of about it. Outside of Eastern Europe and Russia, you might consider China, Cuba, Yugoslavia, and Vietnam part of the Second World, but those countries didn't all get along the same way as the First World countries did. Okay, so we talked about some other rivalries. The first big rivalry that defined the Cold War was the space race. This was the US versus the Soviet Union getting people and satellites into space, and dogs and monkeys into space as well. And initially, the Soviet Union struck first. They got a dog there. You can see little Laika on the left. Was sent into space before we put any living beings into space. So we came back with a monkey, because obviously a monkey. And there was a lot of fear that by putting these satellites into space, of course, that the Soviet Union was going to dominate the United States, that those things up there in the sky were going to kill us or attack us or whatever. So we came back. And of course, we were the first to the moon. And so the image on the right there shows an Apollo landing on the moon, where we planted the U.S. flag, which is not like a subtle reminder that we were the ones who got there first. So imagery and propaganda were all lined up in the space race. And of course, the fact that we haven't been back to the moon since the Cold War ended, may have shown you where our motivations were when it came to that project. It was about showing up the Soviets. It wasn't necessarily about exploration for exploration's sake. The second major rivalry was an arms race, specifically in using nuclear weapons. Now, the image on the screen is not an actual image from history. This is from a movie, and it was a sort of dramatic depiction of what the U.S. nuclear war room might look like. And there was tons of mythology around the Cold War. The spying and espionage, created things like James Bond. You just look at the movies that were created about the Cold War, and especially the nuclear arms race and stuff. It was a major feature of our culture for both countries. So mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was sort of the summary of our nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. The fear was that if the Soviet Union were to strike the United States first, we had to have enough nuclear weapons to wipe them out as well, hence the mutually assured part. And this would create a situation where neither side would use their weapons, because we knew it was ultimately useless. The 1980s movie War Games summed this up best, where the sort of advanced computer program runs through all of these nuclear war scenarios, and it comes up and decides that the best way to win the game is just to not play. And while there are a couple of incidents where we actually came close to nuclear war, generally speaking, we were able to safely deter nuclear conflict. And of course, the one most notable or most famous example where we almost went to war was the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, when John F. Kennedy was president. The Soviet Union had snuck some nuclear missiles into Cuba, which was very close to the United States. And that proximity was problematic, because that would theoretically mean that they could get nukes up faster than we could respond. And we were just very, very opposed to that. And eventually the Soviet Union backed down and pulled its missiles out of Cuba. All right. Now, what about the third world? This is our so-called non-aligned movement. And these were countries around the world that said, you know what, we don't want to be part of this rivalry between the U.S. and Soviet Union. You can see a lot of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America join the non-aligned movement. And these, of course, were countries that, as we're going to talk about next week, are newly independent countries, colonized countries who were like, we don't want a part of this. Like, we've seen what you people do. And while we like the idea of a free market and democracy and all that stuff, at the end of the day, you guys colonized us and you took away our freedoms. So, like, we're not in a big rush to be part of your club this time around. The dark blue states were then members of a movement that started in 1961 called the non-aligned movement. The lighter blue were observer states, and so they weren't technically part of it. And you're going to see a lot of parts of the Soviet Union are in there. Communist China is in there, of course. The founder was this guy, Joseph Tito, who's the leader of Yugoslavia. And among the other founding members were India, Egypt, Indonesia, these big countries that were newly independent states that didn't want to be a part of the first or second world. Okay, so ultimately the Cold War ends. And it ends not with war, but with the Soviet Union kind of throwing its hands up and surrendering, more or less. The two terms that are associated with the end of the Cold War are the policies of glasnost and perestroika. And we associate these with the guy who has a map on his forehead over there, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's on the right in that image. You've got older George H.W. Bush in that image as well, because the Cold War ends during his presidency in 1991, 1992. He's going to be president after Reagan. And during his single term, the Cold War ends. So Gorbachev pushes to open up Soviet society and the Soviet economy. And those two things combine to sort of end the rivalry between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And as the Soviet society opens up, they get exposed to Western culture, Western ideas, all that propaganda about how terrible Western Europe and the United States is sort of blown away, because they're like, okay, blue jeans, McDonald's, these are not like evil things. Little did they know what was going to happen with the beatus and their waists later on. But once they could see evidence with their own eyes, the Soviet people lost any sort of desire to keep fighting. And then as well, perestroika, the opening of the economy, is going to bring a lot of material goods. We talked about, McDonald's, blue jeans were the sort of stereotypes or cliche examples, but cars and travel and movies and music and all sorts of stuff. And that opening of the economy really does end the Cold War conflict between states. So that's the Cold War. It defined the second half of the 20th century. Certainly my childhood would not have been the same without this. I was born in West Germany because my dad served in Western Germany doing signal corps operations for the U.S. Army. So I was born in the free part of Western Germany. And then my childhood was just all about this rivalry. There's going to be a second Top Gun movie this year, maybe. And of course, the original was like sort of the height of Cold War machismo. We didn't do tornado drills or lockdown drills when I was a kid. We did duck and cover drills where we hid under desks because somehow desks might save us from nuclear destruction. Things like G.I. Joe, where it was all good versus evil. The Cold War defined a generation of a couple of generations of people in the United States and around the world, because we all just lived in fear that somebody's going to push the wrong button and everybody was going to die. And so you could sort of see why the non-aligned movement had an appeal for some countries. So that's the Cold War. Again, if you have any questions about filling out that chart, drop me a line, shoot me an email, or go back and listen. And hopefully I covered as much of it as I could.